Hello everyone, my name is Gabriel Stein. I'm Director Asset Management Services at Oxford Economics. Welcome to the latest in our series of occasional podcasts. I'm sitting here with Nicola Nobile, who is Senior Economist and who's normally based in Oxford but has come down to London for the occasion. Nicola, you have recently published a research briefing on the topic of productivity and capital allocation in Southern Europe. And what you're saying here is essentially that until the advent of the euro, productivity growth in European countries was roughly speaking similar. But following the advent of the euro, and perhaps counterintuitively, since it was supposed to make everything so much better for everyone, or for every country, what's happened is that the periphery countries have lagged in productivity growth. Now, why is that? What makes you say that this happened, and why do you think it happened?
Well, first of all, thank you, Gabriel. Yes, we recently have done this research briefing on productivity, in which we have focused on southern European countries. And what we have found is that, strangely enough, after the introduction of the euro, productivity growth in this country, in particularly I'm referring to Italy, Spain, and to a lesser extent Portugal, was substantially lower than the productivity we were seeing in the 5 years before the introduction of the euro. And we wanted to analyze why it was the case. And in order to do that, we look at some sectoral disaggregation in productivity, and we compare the sectoral productivity with banking flows, and we were saying
with loans, essentially.
With loans, exactly.
Yeah.
And we were saying that the banking system was not financing the most productive sectors, and in fact, what the banking system was doing was financing the least productive sectors, namely construction and services.
But hold on, that again is counterintuitive, isn't it? You would have thought that for the banks it's most interesting to finance the most productive sectors, which likely are going to be the most profitable. So why construction and services?
Well, because the banking system was probably seeing some return into these sectors. And for example, in the case of Spain, you were seeing that housing prices were increasing during this period. So the banking system was giving the loss a lot of money that they were receiving after having joined the euro to companies in construction sector, because house prices were increasing, and so the banking were receiving returns on that. So in a way, this was the quickest way to receive from the banking system some returns from their loans.
Search for yield, so to speak.
Yeah.
But it's still that may be the case for the construction sector. But what about services? Services, you didn't have I don't think I've ever heard of a services sector boom that leads to overextension of credit to the service sector.
Yeah, this is true. But if we look at the disaggregation in services, what you have, and this is more true for Spain than in Italy, is you have a lot of real estates related activities. So in another way, this was the same phenomenon as in the construction sector.
Okay, so it's really services to real estate. Why? But there are still some things that I certainly find puzzling. For instance, you mention Italy, and you have you had a construction boom. In Spain, you had a housing boom. Okay, you had a housing boom. Because you had a housing boom, banks, and in other countries like Ireland as well, banks would lend to the construction sector because, of course, everyone knew that house prices can never fall, so it's a risk-free investment, but until they fall. But Italy didn't have a housing boom. Why did you have a construction lending boom in Italy when you didn't have a housing boom?
Italy didn't have an housing boom, correct, but housing prices over this period still increase in Italy. So again, for a country which was growing probably around 1%, even if housing prices were increasing by 3 or 4%, this means that there was still a lot of relative return coming from the construction sector. And again, probably Italy is a slightly different story, because there you have a lot of companies which are very old, a lot of companies which are very small. You have the banking system which used to have a lot of very small banks that were pretty much tied to the regions or to the area where they're from, and so the allocation of the banking loans were not efficient because of the relationship between the small banks and the small companies.
That has changed, I believe. There's been a lot of consolidation in Italy.
There has been a lot of consolidation in the last 2-3 years, yes.
Okay, so we had a period of subpar, suboptimal credit allocation, which leads to subpar productivity growth. But I seem to remember that in your research briefing you actually say that things are hopefully changing, that there's been some change recently. Should we be more optimistic about the future?
The short answer is yes, and the reasons are different. But for example, we are seeing that the peripheral countries, in particular Spain and Portugal, are less imbalanced than they were before. There have been some structural reform, and I'm thinking about the labor reforms, particularly the one in Spain a few years ago and the one in Italy last year. And looking at a couple of other metrics, so for example the balance of payment for this country, now it is in surplus, while before the crisis it was in a huge deficit. So for example, the deficit for the balance of payment in Spain was minus 10% in 2007, and added to this is we are seeing that more resources, both in terms of investment and in terms of workforce, have been allocated to tradable sectors, and this is more true for Spain and Portugal. We are still lacking in that in Italy, but this leads us to be more optimistic for the current recovery.
Okay, however, isn't there an argument that there are two potential things one could comment there? The first is, yes, Spain and Portugal, and in general the Eurozone periphery, has gone from a fairly massive deficit to a non-trivial surplus on the current account. But how much is that because domestic activity collapsed in the wake of the Great Recession?
That's a good point, and it was probably more relevant 2 or 3 years ago when the Eurozone peripheral countries were into huge recession. Now what we are seeing domestic demand improving, probably also helped by the lower prices and the lower oil price, and we are seeing a small surplus in the balance of payment, which is coupled with an improving domestic demand. So that's for sure a positive fact.
Okay, now then we go to the next potential objection, which is, yes, this is all very well, but doesn't this mean that the Eurozone is attempting to force the rest of the world to solve the Eurozone's problems by everyone in the Eurozone attempting to save more and so forth, and pushing the burden of adjustment through a large and widening current account surplus on the rest of the world? I mean, you mentioned the activity is picking up, but is it really picking up sufficiently?
Well, that's why we are not. That's certainly true. That's one of the reasons for which we are not seeing productivity or GDP increasing by huge figure. That's one of the reasons for which we are seeing GDP increasing by 1.5 this year and 1.8 next year, and productivity going back.
This is where in peripheral Europe as well?
No, this is more in the Eurozone in general.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so some steps taken, cautious optimism, possibly less so in the case of Italy, but more so in the case of Spain. Portugal, I will say in between Spain and Italy, given that there has been some reforms, particularly after the bailout. Okay. Do you want to comment on politics as well? Threat to the Portuguese economic reforms, possible issues in Spain, or would you rather not? Would you rather leave that?
I know that for example, our Portuguese economist Ricardo Amaro has done has published some publication regarding the recent Portuguese politics and elections with the government that hasn't been created yet. So probably that will cause some uncertainty on the market in the next few months.
Well, we'll obviously have to see. Nicola, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening, and we will be back with further podcasts.